back to radical decisions in Germany that has reopened 3 coal plants painfully, according to the German Chancellor, to supply enough energy that can take Germany through the winter. Of course, Russia closing its taps to some parts of Europe. It's interesting conversations right now, and we'll get right into it. I think I should start with Prof. Prof, let's start off with you. Maybe we can start with the latest on the war. We just saw on international news that Russia released about 83 missiles on Ukraine. Perhaps could you get a brush and paint for us a picture of the situation in Ukraine and indeed about the war? Let's start there, Prof.
Well, can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this event. It's my great pleasure to be able to talk to this new audience. I've been talking to all sorts of audiences in the last almost 8 months, because in a few days from now, there'll be 8 months from a start date of a massive Russian invasion against Ukraine, which started obviously on February 24th this year. But I also took part in a number of events organized by various US embassies around the world. But it's my first time speaking to audience in Africa, and I really appreciate this opportunity. And so thank you very much for inviting me. The war is very much ongoing. It enters its new stage, it seems. The Ukrainian ground forces are moving slowly but surely in liberating Ukrainian lands from Russian occupation. It's a hard process. It will take time, it will take lives, it will take a lot of funds as well, but there is no other way. We need to defend our land. We need to make sure that we do everything possible to liberate the land that's been gained by Russia since February 24th. On the other hand, Russia is not being capable to advance anymore in Ukraine, and for a long time now, Russia is trying to switch to different types of pressure on Ukraine. Well, from the very beginning, actually, they were not only fighting military troops of Ukraine, but mostly focusing on actually fighting infrastructure, like oil reservoirs, for instance, railroads and so on, and also quite often civilian facilities. So that's why we have a much higher number of people dying among civilians actually than among military personnel. So that's a problem obviously for us. And now they have intensified the shelling of Ukraine in the last several days. They've been using missiles. Several days ago, it was one day when 84 missiles were launched at various Ukrainian cities. That's where Russia still has capability. They have still plenty of those missiles, which can actually enter Ukrainian space and hit any target within Ukraine. No exception, it's a big country, but those missiles, they can fly far. So right now, Russia is hitting the infrastructure primarily, like energy sector, electric powers. I think yesterday our president has said that something like 30% of our electric power stations are down right now because of Russian strikes. Not only they strike with missiles, but they also strike now with drones. They've recently received so-called kamikaze drones from Iran. Iran is denying this, but everyone else is basically saying, yes, that's Iranian drones. Again, Russia received it in a big number. According to Ukrainian sources, about 2,400 Iranian drones. And they send them in big numbers into various areas in Ukraine. And unlike other drones, which primarily are used for reconnaissance and finding out the targets, your Air Force, this is the force with which you strike. So you send a kamikaze drone and it attacks a building or a certain military target or a certain person on the ground. So the recent attacks in Kyiv, for instance, our financial capital and national capital, been used primarily done by these kamikaze drones. So Ukraine is learning how to fight better those missiles and drones. We're downing more and more of them, and we're getting more and more Air Force defense weapons from our friends around the world. But still, many of those getting through the shield, because we don't have anything like Iron Dome in Israel, for instance. So we don't have any such advanced, sophisticated air defense systems. So therefore, a lot of those missiles and drones are getting through to the targets, and there you have explosions and they have you damage to Ukrainian infrastructure. But to finish answering this particular question, I should say with an update and briefing on the war, that morale in Ukraine is kind of high, even though, of course, the country is sustaining heavy damage every day to its economy, which is pushing us to think about what will happen when the war is over and how long will it take for us to recover and rebuild our economy after Russian invasion. We are also incurring losses on the battlefront. So obviously, it's a long line of battlefront that we have with Russia. Again, military experts say it's about 2,500 kilometers. So that's a huge distance. Someone put it in a straight line on the map of Europe, and it stretches from Warsaw in Poland to Madrid in Spain. That's how long the battlefront is. And basically, almost everywhere you have fighting between Ukrainian and Russian troops. So clearly, in terms of scale, that's the biggest war in the war, perhaps, but clearly in Europe, if you talk about Europe, clearly since Second World War. And Ukrainians are still hoping that our military, with support of society, will be able to liberate Ukrainian lands. More of them, all of them, if possible. The civil society is actively assisting the army. There is incredible amount of consolidation in the country. Ukrainian political nation is as unified and coherent and strong as never before. So surprisingly, of course, we would rather not have this invasion against us, frankly, but at the same time, there are some positive implications. And also, I think there will be positive implications beyond Ukraine in various other countries in the region, in Europe, elsewhere, when the people would be more serious in securing themselves and providing more security for themselves because of this wake-up call. Thank you.
Wow. Have Ukrainian allies been helping Oblek with these latest strikes from Russia?
Can you say it again, please?
Have the Ukrainian allies been helping Ukraine in the latest strikes from Russia?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I didn't hear the word allies. Well, there are many of them, frankly, and quite a few helping very intensively, others less so. But formally, there are 50 countries that are helping Ukraine with weapons. There is a so-called contact group on defense of Ukraine, and last meetings had something around 50 countries joining. At the same time, we should understand that Ukraine, not all of them are helping Ukraine in massive numbers, sending lots of weapons, and none of them obviously sending troops. That needs to be understood. That has been declared by all countries to the west of Ukraine, NATO, US, and others, as a no-go, as a complete ultimate, red line. They don't want a direct confrontation with Russian military forces, so therefore no troops being sent. But other things like weapons, they've been sent. Some countries more active, others less so. Among the most active in terms of numbers and types of weapons that have been sent to Ukraine, you obviously have United States, United Kingdom, you have Netherlands, you have Denmark, you have Norway, you have Czech Republic, you have Poland, and you have a number of Baltic countries like Lithuania and others. So it's a big number of countries that are sending these weapons now. The needs for Ukrainian military are changing. For instance, in the early days of the war, there was a focus on anti-tank missiles that you can launch from your shoulder, the javelins, or stingers, which you can shoot the helicopter or maybe even low-flying airplane with. Because the Russian troops were approaching bigger cities of Ukraine, including capital Kiev. So those anti-tank weapons were really needed, and they kind of stopped Russian troops. They lost a lot of those tanks. But with time, we needed to have more. We need, for instance, where I'm from, Odessa, on the coast of the Black Sea, we need anti-ship missiles, for instance, because Russia has total domination, naval domination in the sea. So they were planning on using perhaps their naval ships, battleships to attack Ukraine and maybe do a landing operation, but they never did it because Ukraine got in time some of those missiles. Some of them were actually developed by Ukraine itself, but options, other received from other countries like Harpoons and others. So right now, Russian ships are vulnerable. They're trying not to get too close to Ukrainian coast because they can be stricken with missiles based on the land, on the shore. on Ukrainian territory. There was a case you probably heard about it several months ago when the flagship of Russian Navy in the Black Sea, the cruiser called Moscow, was sank by direct strikes of Ukrainian missiles and went to the bottom of the sea. So that was quite a moment, quite a telling, revealing moment. Of course, Ukrainians rejoiced and Russia got really upset about it, that their best ship they have had there in the region is no more, basically staying there on the bottom of the sea. So with aircraft defenses now, again, like I say, paradoxically enough, with more strikes on Ukraine, it actually brings some positive results because everyone is now rushing this air defense systems to Ukraine. Before there was only discussion like, should we give to Ukraine this or that air defense system? And right now, when they see this massive strikes by missiles on big cities and energy infrastructure, a lot of countries are basically saying, okay, we're going to deliver something to you right now, like today, tomorrow, or day after tomorrow, something like that. So Americans are doing, Germans have sent some, and others are considering sending some more of up-to-date, more kind of a contemporary anti-air defense systems. Thank you.
Wow, Prof, thank you for grounding us with the situation. It's really sad there, and certainly that has caused shifts in both the food and the energy dynamics, not only in Europe, but also globally. I mean, Ukraine producing 16% of the global wheat, 40% of the global sunflower. That's huge. And you're speaking from Odessa, which is one of the seaports to the Black Sea. What is the situation like, especially since the signing of that agreement back in July? Are we seeing more ships leave Ukraine? And do you think that this is also, in a way, financially, the money that Ukraine is getting from the trade supporting its war? I wanted you to help us ground us in that area around food supply and the food value chain.
Sure. Well, of course, it's a big deal to us, the grain trade. Not only grain, but also other agricultural products and foodstuffs, like, for instance, the fertilizers, the soya, beans, the sunflower oil, cooking oil, and many others. So it's definitely not just wheat, that you make bread of it. It's a major item for Ukrainian economy, especially in the south of Ukraine, where you have very fertile soils. You can actually have very nice harvests there. To the extent that during the Second World War, for instance, the German occupiers, the Nazis, then they wanted to. They actually were trying to do this. They were taking away the upper layer of the soil, putting it in a train and bringing it back to Germany, hoping that it would be able to be used back in Germany. It didn't work, but it tells you how fertile and nice those soils are, so you can have a nice harvest. And a big portion of our economy, especially in my region, historically, even my city of Odessa, is dealing with this and connected to this. Odessa was one of the biggest cities in the region since the mid of 19th century, frankly, primarily because it was this gate through which you would have goods and cargo coming through various directions, from Russian Empire at that point of time to the rest of the world, and vice versa, from the rest of the world to Russian Empire, and then then Soviet Union, now Ukraine. So it's very important for us to have this transit trade. So early in the war, after February 24th, there was a Russian blockade imposed on Odessa and the entire Black Sea coast. It's not just Odessa, it's also ports in the region. And that, of course, was detrimental, really bad for our economy. I mean, it was bad for our security too, because you would have shellings and you would have battleships in the sea. And early on, we were really afraid of maybe some big landing operation with troops coming onto the beaches and attack certain cities. That didn't happen. For the economy, definitely, you had a lot of grain and other stuff in the storage units, and you cannot export it. And we've tried everything else, but it seems like the sea routes, the sea lines is the only reasonable way to do it. Because if you put it in a train, well, it's a smaller number, it takes time, you need to go around, there's only one major train line going out of Odessa to the west. That's a problem. On the trucks, it's even less of an option, because you wouldn't really put much of it. So even prior to this grain deal, which was signed on July 22nd, you had also river ships leaving Odessa and other ports and coming along the Ukrainian coast and into the river of Danube. And that's a big river. Some people call it European river because it actually goes across most of Europe, and then you can export some of that grain through this river. But again, it's smaller ships. It's just river ships comparing to what you use on the sea, on the ocean. It's much smaller amounts. Right now, of course, there's been already hundreds of ships left and came back. So we're dealing with this issue, and it's good for our economy, good for our business. And they were really down and they were really upset. They're not happy about this blockade. But now the blockade is lifted. Russia has been complaining a little bit about this grain deal in recent days, but we all hope that it will continue. And among other things, by the way, Russia, because of that grain deal, they've got this sanctions elevated on their own food exports. So it's a good thing to them, with many other industries in their economy being sanctioned still. In terms of agricultural export that they have from Russia, they can do it because of this grain deal from July 22nd. So frankly, if they decide to do something to get out of it, to stop, to halt this deal, that would be stupid on their part because it would be also bad for their economy, which is struggling already under the sanctions. And also it would tell people that Russia is not really interested in the dialogue, in the trade, in helping countries in need, that having shortages, lack of food supply. So I hope they wouldn't do it, but they might because they've been taking some irrational decisions over years in recent months, including this decision to have a massive invasion into Ukraine, which is a big country. It's the biggest European country if you don't count Russia itself. If you consider Russia a European country, then Ukraine is the biggest one, and we have a population of over 40 million, which is reasonably large population, and we have people who are well educated. You have people who were trained in the army, because the Russian war against Ukraine actually started back in 2014. It was a different scale, it was a low intensity, but a lot of people in Ukraine went through the war, so they've got this experience. So we can go back, if you would want to, in our discussion, discussing these factors, like how is it possible that Ukraine, which is a smaller country comparing to Russia, was able to withstand and fight back, and actually even now liberating some of them.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying, because while you were making those submissions, there's a lot of news that is going out to the global world about that particular issue of food security, and how the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has actually caused the whole global shift and caused a crisis, a food crisis. But along the way, Russia has sort of spun that it is not responsible for the food shortage. In fact, Vladimir Putin is quoted blaming the West to the food crisis. And I just wanted to read his quote on one of, and that is Rossiya TV, a Russian media outlet. He said that first, the situation with the global food markets did not become worse yesterday, or even with the launch of Russia's special military operation in Donbass in Ukraine. This should be blamed on the sanctions that the West has put on Russia. Your thoughts, Doc, Prof, before we can bring in Grace here. What are your thoughts on Russia's spin to the global food crisis, blaming it on the West because of the sanctions they have put on Russia?
Right. Well, it's what Russia does. I mean, they're never to blame. It's always someone else's fault. Like prior to February 24th, they said, "Oh, it's aggressive America, aggressive NATO, aggressive Ukraine. They're planning aggression against us." No proof of that. And then they moved with their forces, and they don't call it war. Still, formally, they don't call it war. They call it a special military operation. I think initially they wanted to have a big kind of urgent type operation in and out, defeat Ukrainians quickly and then get out maybe with some troops, or maybe occupy a certain part of the country. So it didn't work. I mean, it doesn't really matter at this point what they wanted to do. at the beginning. In terms of their narrative and propaganda, it's really failing in many ways. I mean, the Russian propaganda machine has been massive in recent years, if not decades. They've really spent a lot of time on it, and a lot of funds on funding this machine. So it's been really working, in overdrive mode. But not for the recent several months. Many of their arguments are falling on deaf ears around the globe. But with this particular one, first of all, if Russia does not invade Ukraine on February 24th in such a massive way, there wouldn't be any global food crisis to speak of. If Russia withdraws its troops from Ukrainian territory, internationally recognized, including by Russia in many treaties, bilateral treaties signed by Russia and Ukraine, there would be the immediate end of global food crisis. Well, there would be some damage, of course, to Ukrainian economy because they also bombed our elevators where you put the grain. They also, sent some incendiary, devices like bombs and missiles. That's what when you use them, it causes fire against the fields in Ukraine, actually, to create fires in the fields and damage the harvest. So that's obviously a problem, But if the war stops today, it's going to be more or less fine. Ukraine still has a lot of capacity for producing more food stuff. So no, it's not our fault. It's not anyone's fault. It's the blockade itself that brought their ships to the coast. They said you couldn't go anywhere. They actually shelled some ships early in the war. There were around 100 ships of various countries being kind of frozen, blocked in Ukrainian ports because the war started, and they were not allowed to leave for a certain period of time, and also not safe to leave because there are mines in the sea. So actually sheltered certain ships that tried to leave. Russian Navy shelled them, and one of them sank, actually went down in the sea. So if there would not be for their behavior in this particular respect, then there would be no global food crisis whatsoever. I mean, there probably would be a global food crisis of a similar size and scale that you had in previous years, because there is always some kind of a food crisis, and shortage of food around the globe is not something new. It's not entirely new phenomenon, but not on this scale, because you have two countries involved in the war who are the major producers of these agricultural products. So no, I don't think this argument flies. I mean, and it's very easy to stop this, stop the carnage, stop killing Ukrainians, stop killing Russians too, because they're dying here in Ukraine in huge numbers too. Stop damaging Russian economy and basically pushing Russia into a corner, into a dead end in its evolution, in its development, which will be felt in Russia for years and decades to come, and just withdraw the troops. And then, well, there will be still discussions about what they did in Ukraine, war crimes and everything, but at least there will be a stop of war. And that immediately, like I said, would be meaning that there is no more global food crisis.
Wow. Thanks for that, because it's important for us to be grounded. Let me bring it back home. Ever since the July agreement that was signed between Turkey and Ukraine, and Turkey and Russia, and the UN, we have had about 1.7 million tons of grain, going into the global market. And I think just last week, the Foreign Affairs Minister for Ukraine announced that about 51,000 tons of grain had arrived in Mombasa. But also it's the same time when Russia's Foreign Affairs envoy, Lavrov, said that they were giving huge donations of food to Sudan and the Central African Republic. And of course, among others, the cancellation of the $162 million loan to Ethiopia and turning it into development aid by Russia made headlines. So looks like Ukraine and Russia are all up for Africa. I mean, we've had both the Foreign Affairs Minister of Russia, Lavrov, coming to visit Uganda, Ethiopia, Congo, and of course, the Foreign Affairs Minister for Ukraine was supposed to come, and then went back and addressed a press conference later on online, which I attended, speaking of giving technology to developing countries to grow their own food and also supplying fertilizers. Grace, I just wanted you to put this in context. A lot of information has been going out We've been taking it all in, and in there is disinformation and misinformation, and too many things to take in. So I wanted you to speak to my audience this evening. What are the facts, and why should we concerned? Why should we get concerned about this food crisis as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict? Grace.
Thank you, Solomon. The question still is very clear that we see a lot of interest coming to Africa now for Russia and Ukraine. However, to us, we believe that since the war began, there is a lot of misinformation happening, but there are a lot of results that are showing that this war has had impact and deserves to be praised for its impact, negative or positive, on the economy. Just to bring you forward to the current food insecure people in the world. Since this year began, it has grown from 135 million people to 195 food insecure people around the world. And then in Uganda in particular, when you talk about food insecure Ugandans, just Karamoja alone as a region, this has not been had before the Ukraine war. And we have 400,000 people that have been registered, reported as being food insecure. And 56,000 of these are children who are malnourished. And so we cannot stand and say the war has had no full impact. However, bring it back to why we think that this war, your question was about what is in to support for Uganda in particular. I want to give a scenario where we are looking at the wheat brand, which Ukraine and Russia are the key exporters, leading exporters. The dairy companies that we have now are not having enough wheat bran to feed the animals. This is also integrated in the feeds that go to the poultry and livestock sector, and this translates directly to the food insecurity in terms of nutrition. Because now we no longer talk about food insecurity as food. It goes with food and nutrition for a resilient food system. So there has been already this misinformation that this is coming from Russia, and it has led to Russian-Ukraine aggression. When the two foreign affairs ministers came, the African Union had to come in to try and get a position, and we started having political sentiments coming out to try and protect the two foreign envoys, to try and see that they stand a better chance. However, we should know that while we are trying to say that the food aid is coming in, the food aid is not directly aligned to what the communities in Africa really want. And this is a way to get political mileage, but it is not really going to move the African farmer or to the next level. And it has to be African governments to stand instead of political will, which we think that both governments are trying to feed in there. We need to make sure that there is an integrated system for ensuring sustainable food security for our people.
Are you saying that the war in Ukraine has not in any way destabilized the food security and the food supply chain in Uganda from your submission?
I'm saying it really has, and that's why I was giving scenarios of since the war began and looking at the numbers that are growing. I'll bring it out in such a way that when you look at the current fertilizer prices are up, farmers can no longer afford them. And Ukraine and Russia contribute heavily on the fertilizer exports throughout the world. Back to the energy, the energy issue. You may find, before going to the energy issue, the maize price here has grown because people can no longer afford the wheat, and they've been living by wheat, which is imported. So greatly, the effect is seen directly on the table of the consumer, and the people are now resorting to using maize for as an alternative substitute. This has an advantage because one, you'll find that many farmers are now earning. However, because of the impact that there is a low fertilizer import coming in because of the ports being closed in Ukraine and Russia, the low fertilizer input has led to slow down on food security, on the farming systems here, and the farmers are going to be looking out for various alternatives which are not existing. So this definitely has a great impact on the food security system here.
Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Minister was on an African tour, and one of the things he said during his press conference was that Ukraine wanted to provide a sustainable model for Africa to produce its own food through investing in advanced technology and indeed, agricultural practices and research to empower Africa to be able to grow its own food with its own fertile soils. Your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, many people have come here, Solomon, to invest in African technologies, but Ukraine itself is one of the leading suppliers of oilseed. And I think what Africa needs now is to invest in human capacity to produce for itself. Because we've seen that our dependency on foreign states greatly has an effect when they are fighting against each other on the impact that, on the impact of farmers and the output of farmers. And investing in technologies is a good idea, but can we build capacity for African farmers and African governments to invest in their own technology and be able to sustainably scale them out to support farmers and see that we are food secure and we are able to run our systems without any disturbances from foreign disagreements.
Sustainability is very key here. Let me just engage you on the issue of food again. What we saw is that, let me bring it home to our home, you and I, where we stay. The price of wheat, do you therefore believe that the reopening of the international food supply system, like I said, Ukraine is saying they are right now downloading 51,000 tons of grain from Henry, which is the big ship, they call it Henry, in Mombasa, sorry, and Ukraine has promised to send 3 more shipments to East Africa. Isn't it a shame that we actually, as a region, are relying on food imports, grain imports from Ukraine when we have the capacity to actually grow our own food? In other words, I'm going back to what you're saying. What is the problem with Africans, or is within the region, that we have to wait for grain to come into East Africa? But I also wanted you to comment about Russia's donation, so-called donation of food to South Sudan and the Central African Republic, and how it's using it as a foreign tool to actually to prove that it's doing good, so that we don't only focus on the invasion of Ukraine, but also its international policy of supporting food to Somalia, to Sudan, to Central African Republic, and indeed the cancellation of $162 million debt of Ethiopia to Russia. So Russia is coming to Africa with a different narrative rather than just focusing on the Ukrainian crisis. Yeah, I wanted you to make a comment on that.
Thank you, Solomon. And I think it's a real shame that our dependency rate is actually growing. And it comes at a wrong time when Africa has a commitment to end hunger by 2025, just 3 years away. And we still have to open our hands to donations, especially for East Africa. We've been seen for a long time to be feeding the world, to be feeding the continent. And this comes as a shocker, but it is also an opportunity for us to awaken our energy to work towards stopping this and the reoccurrence of this. For this to stop, I think it is high time that our government have public investment reform. We need to reform the way we are doing investment. And through this, we are able to see that we need to harness our public investment management. It's not that we don't have the money to invest in food security or the energy or the brains. It's just that we are doing it the wrong way. So in one way or another, you'll find that because we don't have a proper system of managing resources and ensuring we are investing, we end up misfiring, and this leaves us in the cycle of being dependent on handouts all the time. And also the fact that, again, the recent World Bank report World Bank report on Uganda, it clearly indicates that the economy has dampened since the Ukraine war. But again, it also recommends highly that there should be minimum political interference. When Ukraine is offering food support, Russia is offering food support, these have a lot of political hidden motives that will end up, yes, we know people are hungry, but sometimes when someone is hungry, it is the best time to tell them this is the time to produce enough food for yourselves and sustainably and in an organized way than just giving them handouts to be at the receiving end.
Yeah, before I can go back to Prof, is there a need for us to rethink our investment in the agriculture sector, not only in Uganda, but also within the region and the greater part of Africa? Doesn't this go back to a mindset change, especially in our budgeting? We've always been saying, agriculture is the backbone of Uganda's economy, but from the budget allocation towards the agriculture sector, the investment in technology in the agriculture sector, the investment in agro-processing, the investment in extension work and services to the farmers, focus to the farmers. We seem to be moving away from that and investing more into the industrialization agenda, because there's this thought that we will grow when we better our industries. And yet you are saying that there's need for a mindset shift for us to be more food secure in the future, even when there is a global crisis.
Thank you, Solomon. Truthfully, there is need for a mindset change. However, we should, like you rightly said, the mindset should go towards investment, not towards allocation of resources towards the African agriculture system. We have commitments where Uganda and other countries in East Africa are committed to, and that one of them is ending hunger by 2025. Key that everybody knows is investing 10% of our budgets to agriculture. This is by the Maputo Maputo Malabo Declaration and the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program. However, we need to make sure that everybody is accountable to the commitments that Uganda makes. These commitments should not necessarily all end up being just document papers archived somewhere there and nobody is able to use them. There is no public awareness in the long run on the commitments Uganda has. The commitments made by, I mean, the agendas made by entities like FAO need to be domesticated to make sure that our people are able to understand. And the mindset change, again, goes back to the issue of political interference. Mindset change should be able to go through the political leadership. I'll give an example. You find that our leaders today just don't know any commitment. They are political leaders. They don't take time to run into understanding what commitments exist and will help to move an individual out of poverty or out of a food insecure scenario, but rather they look at the mindset towards just mobilizing votes and going politically is what has driven most programs that we have in East Africa and Uganda as well. I'll give an example of the current program of giving free subsidies in Kenya as an intervention. It's not sustainable, but it is happening. But I think that is better than giving farmers free handouts. So this makes the farmers' hands closed up and only wait for government as a sustainable provider of different products. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Prof, let me come to you. My last one on food security, and then we can jump into the energy, and then I can open it up to my audience. Well, we have a lot to learn from Ukraine. We have fertile soils. I don't know if you've come to East Africa, but Uganda is a very fertile country. You throw a bean there, the next day it will germinate. I mean, we all know that. But perhaps what really concerns me is that we have to import wheat. Okay, maybe because of the weather, I don't know. We have to import grain from Ukraine. But needless to say, while Ukraine is a global food basket, do you still have enough in store for the next 5 years or 2 to 3 years if the fighting continues? Because I believe that there is no agricultural production happening. Perhaps you're now looking at using some of the reserves that you've already stored to actually feed the world. But what does Ukraine's muscle to feed the world look like for the next 1 or 2 years, and how that fits into the global food chain and food security? Prof.
Right. Well, first of all, there is agriculture still in Ukraine, and there've been harvests this year. There've been a lot of food stuff gathered in Ukraine, despite fighting and shelling and missiles flying. And there've been some of the very dramatic footage in the video you can see on YouTube. And if you Google it, you would have Ukrainian farmers basically trying to pick up the harvest. But when the shelling is happening, basically missiles flying over their heads. Several times the Russian troops also fired tractors of the farmers and so on, and many fires they were trying to put down the fire. So we've collected the harvest. I mean Ukrainians. I'm not a farmer, but they did a lower number, much lower number, of course, than we did prior to the war, but they did. The problem is that it's accumulating in the storages. So the storages are still full. Many of them was a previous harvest, so we're trying to export that first and then fill out those storages facilities later. Also, another problem, of course, that Russia has occupied a big portion of Ukrainian south, and what happens there? They're basically stealing Russian grain and wheat and other food stuff, and selling it as Russian, and basically sometimes sending it. Trying to prevent it from people being identifying this as a Ukrainian grain, but that's what they're doing. So I think in the longer run, of course, we hope that the war will end sooner the better. no one is really thinking about the war going on for like 3 or 5 more years. I mean, not on a scale that you have right now, because actually it is going on for 8 years already since 2014, but it was a low intensity conflict and now it's different. So on a different level that we have now in the recent almost 8 months, I don't think it will be any of the countries, Russia and Ukraine, to be fighting so intensively. So I think there will be some drop down in the level of hostilities, and therefore there will be opportunity for our agriculture to go forward.
Interesting, very interesting to hear that farmers are out in the garden tilling amidst flying missiles and bullets. That's quite interesting. Let's shift to the energy issues. We'll spend about 3 to 4, 5 minutes on that. The West, indeed Europe, is going into winter. And there have been worries that many of the European countries may not survive without the supply of gas from Russia, and that the dynamics have caused mindset shifts in different countries. Germany reopening its coal plants to, leverage so that they don't go through an energy crisis. The countries in France and the greater part of Europe, Norway, Finland, have all been rethinking. The EU has been thinking through what can they do as Russia closes its taps, especially on gas. Your thoughts on the energy crisis in Russia, in Europe, and whether indeed Europe can survive the winter without supply of gas from Russia?
Right. Well, I think it's a serious crisis, obviously, something that we haven't seen before. It also joins the bigger global, wider inflation crisis. Well, still not a major world economic crisis similar to what happened, say, 2008, but it's definitely a slowdown, a very serious recession in many places. Well, to put it more accurately, maybe there is no even slowdown, but the prices are growing up, and they are going up faster than the salaries in many places. So that is obviously a problem on food, but also on energy. Europeans are doing what they can, but here you have countries that are more advanced, obviously economically, so they have the budget for this. They can budget the money to reorient themselves away from Russian energy supply, for instance. That's what they're doing quite quickly, actually. And I think Russia is making a big mistake here in this respect, because they are on the verge of losing a very important European market for themselves in terms of energy supply. On the other hand, they are also preparing the money to pay to the people who are consuming energy and whose energy bills will be really high this winter. So the governments in all European countries are thinking about how much money they can give directly to the people, so they'll be able to afford those high prices. So it's a number of steps and policies that they have taken. Ukraine itself is going to be in a difficult position, obviously, over this winter. We're already getting ready for major problems with energy supply. We had this perspective even prior to the recent days, but in the recent days, Russia is specifically targeting the Ukrainian energy system. So when Zelensky is saying that 30% of Ukrainian electric power stations are now down, that's a problem, obviously, for Ukraine, but also, by the way, for other countries, because Ukraine was exporting some of the electric energy to other countries. Right now, not anymore, obviously, because we're consuming everything we have. Everything we produce, we're consuming now in Ukraine in terms of energy, obviously. It's going to be difficult times, months ahead of us. But like I said, Ukrainians are still not ready to give up. There has always been and still is needs a solution. Russia withdrawing forces, this war ends. No one wants this war to end more than Ukrainians. But we don't want it to end right now at Russians' conditions and give too many concessions. We see that our military forces are liberating our land, and therefore would like to give them more time, frankly, to liberate more land. That's how it is. And that's why a lot of Ukrainians, on the one hand, if you look at the sociological polls in Ukraine, they dislike the war, they hated guts, businesses ruined, many of them had to move out, millions and millions of people left their homes. So, but on the other hand, there's no appetite whatsoever for rewarding Moscow for this aggression, basically saying, okay, you can have those lands that you've occupied, we're fine, let's sit down and sign some kind of a peace treaty. Not to mention that this kind of peace treaty would be really just a piece of paper into Russia. They will do more aggression. And that's a problem for us. We understand there will be more other waves of Russian aggression in the future. That's why we want to be better prepared for those and not to sign a premature peace agreement.
Wow. We're going to put that context in Africa, but just to stay with you on that, if Europe survives the winter with these energy cuts from Russia, where does that leave Russia following the different interventions from the different countries?
I think it's going to be a major loss for Russia because the European market is well developed. It's very steady. You know, it's something that Russia has been using and relying on for years, decades even, because much of it even goes back to the times of the old Cold War, when European countries were consuming some of Russian Soviet, at that point of time, Soviet energy supply. The biggest pipelines being built, like Druzhba, for instance, friendship, was built in Soviet times. So Soviet Union or Russia, they always needed European market for that. And that's a major supply area for Russian economy. In Russia, they are dependent fully on these natural resources and how much they pump out of their land, of their soil, and put it on the market. They are, boasting. They're saying, "Oh, fine, we don't need Europe. We'll go to other places. India is buying more now. China is buying more than ever. Other countries will buy some, and that's true. Some will increase the amounts that they purchase from Russia, but that wouldn't be substituting for European market. So Putin, I think, Russian leader Putin, he really miscalculated in terms of what he's doing. He thought that Europe would say at some point in time, okay, fine, stop this war, let's apply pressure on Ukrainians, let's force them to sign some treaty with Russians, because we couldn't sustain this. We couldn't live with these higher prices. We couldn't live without Russian energy. But this recent 8 months have shown that they can. That the pace, the speed, the quickness with which Europeans in many countries are turning away from Russian energy and looking for some alternative sources of energy supply is amazing. It's mind-boggling. No one here in Ukraine expected this. No one expected for the European Union, which is often criticized for very slow-moving and timid and indecisive body, that would come up quickly. There's, for instance, Ursula von der Leyen, who's in charge there. She's very tough and she makes right decisions. And therefore, Europe, within 8 months, they have done more than they could be able to do within, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years in peaceful times. Because suddenly they understand, oh, that's not good. We are drug addicts. And the person pushing us as drug, in this case, Russian energy, is not having a, we are depending, and that's a problem. We need to diversify, we need to get away, get off this needle, So that is happening, and I think it's going to be a major blow for the Russian economy, and a lot of Russian economists understand that. A big portion of Russian political elite understood that even prior to February 21st. That's why they were not really enthusiastic about the whole massive invasion. But the problem is you have one person who is calling the shots. Unlike Ukraine, when you have as
you conclude.
And Zelensky is a party political system. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Because Europe, like you say, in 15 months has, we thought how they have reacted to the energy crisis there. Let me bring it back to Africa, because certainly the fuel prices have gone up. We all know here in Uganda, just about 2 weeks ago, OPEC member states sat and decided to actually cut production by 2 million barrels per day. Now, what that basically means is that they're going to be producing less. And what that means is that the supply demand forces are going to come in And I kid you not, November is going to be bad. Fuel prices are going to soar up steadily. And that, of course, if you marry that with the Ukrainian, the Russia-Ukraine war, things are going to be bad. I don't want to be a prophet of doom, but the president, while meeting Lavrov, who is Russia's foreign affairs minister, addressed a press conference and said, our colleagues from Russia are able to supply us with fuel. And perhaps that was a strategy that Uganda was looking for to sort of manage the soaring fuel prices. And Russia was using this as a tool or foreign policy tool to continue to strengthen its relations with Uganda. I want to get your thoughts on the energy crisis, but also how Russia has reacted to it and our preparedness. Like we've heard from Professor Dobovyk, that Europe has been able to do so much in 15 months than they have done in 15 years because of the challenge they faced. But can Uganda do, and indeed Africa, do so much within the limited time, considering the crisis and the reaction from the Gulf region? Your thoughts?
Thank you, Solomon. Our preparedness, I don't believe we are there. In terms of the decision by Russia and the decision by OPEC, I think we already in, I'll use a lighter word, we're already in trouble. Because one, this is not just going to affect our livelihoods as Africans and Ugandans per se. It's going to affect the entire system going down. I'll just tell you that just last week, as we were trying to roll out doing some extension surveys, extension workers in this country, Uganda, were able to report that due to the increased use of fuel, I mean like price of fuel, the mechanization of agriculture has gone down. Farmers cannot afford to buy fuel to run the tractors. And what are they resorting back to? The hand hoe. And what does that mean? That there is a delay in the process system of cultivating and production. Two, when the fuel prices go up, there is an issue of transporting food to the nearby market. So people are going to resort back to bicycles. And how far can a bicycle take you when you're taking 2 tons of maize or of bananas? So there is already a gap there that is going to hit us. Apart from people getting prepared, those with vehicles that are in, like you say, in November and probably December, there is going to be, there is already something is happening. We are now having the season that is started. Government has tried to come in to give free planting, quick maturing crops, seeds to farmers, but all this cannot really, is not a sustainable solution. Our preparedness is questionable, given the fact that we have already had issues of not even having our reserves. So I think this is more of a political situation, a political trap, trying to have a buy-in, but also to hoodwink the people. So what we are calling on what I would advise is for people to seek alternative measures to the current situation. And what are these? Probably there are biofuels happening, and these have been they stop production at some point. This cannot be sustained. It's not at high levels, but we need to think of alternatives that can help them. The farmer, I talk too much about the farmer because he's the end user of all these products.
Grace, thanks. I don't know if we have a lot of alternatives and whether we are really prepared. We all know our fuel reserves. I don't know, every time we have these issues of fuel crisis, we go back as journalists to the story of, do we also have fuel reserves and have we prepared? One of the things that came to my mind, and I'm just giving this now, not as a moderator, but as someone who is observing things from afar. When COVID-19 had fast struck, and I'm sure that's the same situation that was in Ukraine and Russia and Europe, fuel prices came to negative. We all remember when fuel prices dropped drastically to about negative, to an extent that the Gulf did not have where to put the fuel, right? It was too much. Now, I would have thought that at that time, countries would take advantage to actually try to stock up. You know, in envisioning maybe a crisis coming up. Now that that didn't happen. So the Gulf has decided to cut production by 2 million tons. The Ukrainian-Russia crisis continues. The European Parliament is putting pressure on Uganda not to produce the 6.5 billion barrels of oil onto the global markets. Not to say we are not constructing a refinery here, not now. I think the first investment is going into the 1,445 kilometer oil pipeline from, you know, from the Albertine Graben all through to the coast. So hold tight. I think we are going to have a crisis in November. It's coming, and maybe we just have to see how we can go through it. It's your time to talk back. If you have a point, concern, comment, question to my two panelists, I'll give you a minute each. You can introduce yourself, and also we'll be having some comments from our online audience. Professor, we have a friend of yours, Anna Reisman, who shares her love and gratitude to you. She was excited that you're going to be one of the speakers today. So I think she'll have a question or comment to you. But thanks. If you have a question here, you can put up your hand. And I want to call Anna. She always supports with moderating this. Anna, thank you. Over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Professor Dobovyk. Thank you, Dr. Musumami. Thank you, Solomon, for moderating. As with our previous dialogue, we're going to go back and forth between online and in-person questions. I'm going to try to give folks who we did not hear from at the last dialogue a chance to speak first. We'll start with an in-person question. Please keep your questions to a question rather than a comment, and please keep it to under 30 seconds. All right, do we have folks in the audience who would like to ask a question? I know we have someone in person who came here from over an hour and a half away to be here in person. So why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much, Anna. I have a question for Professor and Grace. Professor, it is quite difficult discussing issues of food security in the context of war. We know war causes a lot of destruction and disruptions. But it is also quite humbling to hear that even in the midst of war, Ukraine is still able to reserve some extra food and give it out to Africa. If you could be kind enough, what is it that your country and the people of Ukraine have done right to ensure that you have enough food for yourselves and you can also be able to export some extra food to Africa? Grace, we have so many policy frameworks and many development projects, whether it is poverty eradication, whether it's plan for modernization of agriculture, but somehow things do not work. What is it?
So, Professor, why don't we hear from you first, and then we'll go over to Ms. Mommy.
Yeah. I can see a lot of questions in the room, and I also saw a lot of questions in the chat, so I'll be trying to be brief answering each of those. A great question, thank you. Well, for now, Ukraine has enough food and food supply for itself to make us last for a long time. We don't have any hunger, we don't have any issues with lack of supply. Only in the first days of the war, there was infrastructural supply being disrupted, so suddenly you wouldn't see certain types of food in the stores, but that only happened for like 2 or 3 days, and then everything was put back in place. So, with the exception of certain areas along the front line where you have shelling and everything, where you obviously have problems with food supply, everything else is actually fine in Ukraine. We don't have long lines for bread or anything like that. So we actually have in many cities people sitting nice in the cafes. You wouldn't even know there is a war ongoing. I mean, there's this discussion in our society, is it okay or not? Because there is a big war and some people are dying on our side on the front line. So, and others are sitting in the cafe and having a beer. You know, is it something that is fine or not in ethical means? But others are saying, look, these people are probably spend their day at work. They donated some money for military forces. They maybe, you know, volunteered to help certain hospitals or something. What they're doing is also needed for our economy because there are, you know, in the cafe or in restaurants, you know, you also have people who are struggling to survive. So why not keep this activities? So for now, like I said, we're not necessarily worried about the food supply, but as you said, if the war becomes really protracted, drags on for a long time, that might change.
I hope that answers your question, but let me give it to Grace to talk about the policies, right?
Thank you very much. Apparently, Solomon chipped in that as one of the other ones. Yeah. Just before I got a note here, someone saying, "Oh, politics cannot feed its people. Politicians cannot feed their people effectively. Farmers are not free." And that comes up to the answer about policies. I think we have so many good policies in Uganda, very many, but the implementation is the problem. Why? Most policies that exist are obsolete. They no longer address the current challenges of food security in this country. 2, they have no implementation strategy. I'll just tell you that we have the agriculture sector plan 2, and I think it's coming to an end. But when you go tracking, we don't go back to track on the results, and the citizens themselves have been left. Once something is launched, nobody goes to find out. We don't have a strong citizenship, citizen coalition that goes to track how effective was this policy, hold government accountable, because these policies are formulated, but this is money that is being scaled out, and it is either misused or does not achieve its targeted plan. The political motivation or influence on these policies is very big. I'll give you an example that just before you see how effective one program is done, you just wake up and they say, "Oh, now we have a new one called Operation Wealth Creation." Just before you have Operation Wealth Creation, you know, oh, we are now having parish development model. We had poverty eradication plan. We had plan for modernization of agriculture. We had NADS 1, we had NADS 2, and all these, and now we have parish development model. And then some of us ask ourselves, okay, this is a good one, but where has the model been tested before it is being scaled down? So I think there are quite a number of factors, and these all call for a robust citizenship accountability program. I'll just tell you that continentally, we have with the biannual agriculture review done by African Union. How many of us here know how Uganda is performing with that review report that is released every 2 years? Even the policymakers don't follow such reviews, and these are carried out to help assist and guide the next step. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting one. All right, let's go to online questions that have been coming through. Let me start with a question from Martin Chizito, and you should both write it down. It says to both speakers, we can project increased food insecurity among African countries as the war continues in Ukraine. But we also see the efforts made by Ukraine to export grain to Africa. So are we likely to see changes in the voting patterns of African countries that have been abstaining at the Security Council? Question. So basically saying the war is continuing. Uganda as a country abstained from voting at the UN, but also their members within the Security Council. So it's saying, will there be a shift in the voting patterns at the UN and indeed at the Security Council on the war in Ukraine following the food crisis and how Ukraine is trying to supply food? That's a question from Martin Chizito. Mr. Chizito, thank you. There's another question from Drake Sempija, who says, in your view, how can African governments turn the energy game in their favor, given that we have substantial energy resources as a continent, including oil, uranium, and coal? Right? That's a question from Drake Sempija. And there's another question that given the time may be good to give Volodymyr a chance to speak on the energy insecurity in Europe and the war. I think he spoke about that, right? Let's see how that comes through. Then there's a question from, I think for now we can go with those two questions. Prof, do you want to check on those questions, and then I can come back to Grace? Professor?
Okay, well, I'd like to say that first of all, on the nuclear issue, I think there was a nuclear issue, right? We had a technical sound connection issue. So, but if I'm not mistaken, you were asking me about the opportunity, this scenario when the Russian might use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, right?
Well, we would love to speak about that. But the other question was, are we likely to see changing in the voting patterns at the UN and
right.
Security Council against the Ukrainian?
Well, I see. I don't think it's a question to me. I'm not necessarily following the African developments in this respect, but I'm hoping so, that the people would see who is right and who is wrong in this war. But when we see some people abstaining, to me as an expert, again, not on Africa, but on international relations, this is not surprising because a lot of people say, where are you from? You know, we don't know enough about these two countries. So what's the beef there? What's the problem? They have complicated history going back centuries. You know, why should we be taking strong position in favor of one or another? This is happening like 1,000 miles away from us. And that's understandable completely from a point of view of an ordinary person, but also from a point of view of political elites. You have so many issues, you know, on your own agenda. Why should be they taking strong side in one? You know, we think that the fact that we're being attacked for no reason, that we're having a fair fight, that we're having this liberation defensive war, that other side is committing war crimes and so on against us, and basically often talks about complete genocide of Ukrainians. They're not happy about the Ukrainian nation existing at all. I think that this fact would probably get through to the people throughout the world. But I completely understand. I often talk in interviews to Ukrainian media and saying, look, you're so upset about people not paying more attention to this war or supporting Ukraine, but did you pay much attention to many wars around the globe? And frankly, the answer is no. Because you would normally say, oh, Ukrainians, well, this war is somewhere else. Again, we don't know what this is war about. It's not, doesn't concern me. You know, even people in Russia today, they're talking to the journalists in the streets and they say, this war does not concern me. I'm not interested in politics. That was at least a typical answer before the Putin announced partial mobilization. And now they're snatching people in the middle of the street and sending them to the front line. So that's changing perception. After all, Russians are now worrying about this war and they're concerned. But if you're many miles away, you know, you have your own problems and priorities and challenges to focus on. Why should you take stronger position? And we also understand here in Ukraine that there is a very painful legacy of imperialism, of European/Western imperialism in Africa. So therefore, a lot of people, where are you from? naturally see when US, Britain, France, others support Ukraine, and when the Soviet Union and Moscow was for many, many decades peddling this line that we are for you people against this imperialists, we are anti-imperialists, it's attractive to a lot of people. And people say, oh yeah, that's US and NATO, maybe Ukraine is some kind of a puppet for the West to blame for this war. I understand where it's coming from, but it's not true. It's not meeting the reality. We're not a puppet. We're fighting for our own existence. We didn't start the war. We were attacked brutally just to survive for us physically. My nation, my people, we need to fight back. We didn't have a choice. So that's a message we're trying to convey. And I hope it will be heard. And I hope there will be more votes for Ukraine at the United Nations. But at least there is a very little votes recently for Russia. So okay, abstaining, fine. But at least a lot of countries are not voting for Russia. So that's enough for us. I think that's already a good result.
All right, thanks. Do you want to say one or two? Okay, yeah, and then we can get another question. Anna, do we still have time for a second question? Okay.
Yeah, I will also not attempt to talk about the voting patterns at the UN because that's very political, and I mean, every country has a decision. We cannot push them that much, apparently. But on this issue of the energy for Africa, and this being a game changer, yes. For me, I think this is a learning process. We've depended so much on refineries from outside Africa, but Africa has a lot of resources that it can harness. And what does this mean? That if we came together and managed and had a good strategy for resource management and development as a continent, I mean, countries with oil, countries with gold, going to Congo, get all these minerals and manage them as Africa, have a system of managing rather than competing and everybody wants to access the market individually, then that way we shall have a better strategy of managing our energy resources. I'll give a quick example. The current fight about Uganda being stopped to process its barrels of oil. I mean, this whole scenario is a continental issue, but it has become a Uganda matter simply because we still believe each resource serves a particular community, not a continent. So I think this is a game changer. It's an awakening call to say, I think we need to manage our resources equitably and universally and continentally and work together to make sure that our resources are managed for Africa and within Africa. Thank you.
I think just because we don't have a refinery in Uganda, so we're just adding the 6.5 billion barrels of oil on the global market, and we're just going to transport it and connect it for processing somewhere else, and therefore it may not even come down to reducing the oil prices in Uganda. You know what I mean? Another set of questions.
A lot to talk about here. So I'm going to ask two stipulations for the last question. I'm hoping that Dr. Musmami will stick around for a few minutes afterward and perhaps chat with some of you if he has the time. So I'm going to ask that the last question be directed to Professor Dobovyk, since we will have to say goodbye to him shortly. I believe we've also exclusively had questions from men so far, so I would love to hand the microphone to the woman in the first row.
Thank you very much. My name is Carlton Skevianakon. The African Union has condemned several times the war in Ukraine, the invasion. Of course, like you've explained, the impact this war has had in the energy sector. A liter of petrol costs over 6,000 shillings, just 1 liter. Food security, of course. But African countries continue to abstain, others to vote in favor of Russia. Do we see the African Union change its or start to sanction African countries that allies to Russia? Because the war has had a great impact on food security, the energy sector, So do we see a change in the way the African Union sanctions or conducts its business?
This is a great question. Obviously, I'm not following professionally the African Union, but that's a big integration grouping you've got there. So I think there's a future for this grouping. How coherent their foreign policy would be, that remains to be seen. For instance, with the European Union, which is really deeply integrated entity, political entity, and has been there for decades, still they're struggling sometimes with the common foreign security and defense policy and coming up with certain positions that will be satisfying all. In Africa, there's even more countries than it is in Europe, so it's more complicated to come to certain conclusions and consensus-based decisions. But I think the African Union should be playing a more active role. Also, I think people would learn more about this war as time goes by. Events like today, I think, are useful for audiences in various countries. If people might not know some details, they can learn them from those who are in the know, who know some expertise and know some background on this war. So that's useful too. And I hope that in the future there will be a certain understanding that this war is, for Ukraine, is a war for survival, and for Russia it's an imperialistic war. Ukraine was part of most of Ukraine was part of Russian Empire or Soviet Union for a long time, many centuries. So every time Ukrainians tried to come up with their own state, they were suppressed, in brutal ways. And therefore, now when Putin says there is no such thing as Ukrainian language, Ukrainian nation, this continuation of this imperialistic practices. It's just that people around the world were focusing primarily on more known, notorious empires like British or French, and not on Russia, but Russia is an empire as well. The rhetorics we hear from Russia is primarily focused on great powerness of them trying to be a great power, but in many ways it's an empire. The logic, the rhetorics that's coming from Kremlin, trying to suppress Ukrainian identity, is clearly and also to destroy our economy, so they will be depending on their bigger, stronger economy. That's definitely following the pattern of a discourse on imperialism. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I will give you my thoughts, but after he has.
No, apparently, I think I would agree with Prof that the African Union has the ability to change the narrative. Its biggest challenge is that I keep telling people that the sustainability of the union to sustain itself depends on member states. So it has become practically a bit harder to see the position of African Union being the position of African leaders. Quite often you'll see that it's even hard for the African Union to whip its member states when things go wrong, or to change quite a number of things when they see probably brutality happening, simply because they are being controlled by who funds the union. That is my thinking.
I'll give you my thinking. I think that we haven't grown to that level that the EU is at, where the EU Commission will sit together and say, you know what, go and hang. As the EU, we have given sanctions on Russia and we will stand by them. Are they hurting? Yes, because Russia is increasing global oil prices. Europe is affected. They're going in winter, minus some of that gas. We are going to hurt, but we will stand for this. And we will stand as a union and make a decision against your invasion of Ukraine. And we will do everything we can to actually stand for what we think is right. When it comes to Africa and African Union, indeed, I don't think they've gotten there. Let me give you a classic example of Uganda, which abstained, because we have African countries that voted against the invasion, including neighboring Kenya. We remember the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations making a very strong statement on the position of Kenya on the war. Uganda went quiet, and this is why. Museveni, president, is looking towards the east. And we remember what Uganda came out to say, no one will tell us who our enemies are, right? In the thick of the crisis, we saw Russia's Foreign Affairs Minister Lavrov coming to Uganda, and make no mistake, Lavrov's decision to come to Uganda perhaps was reflected in the way Uganda voted at the African Union. And his coming to Uganda amidst the condemnation, global condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a big statement. It was a big statement of Uganda perhaps solidifying its relationship with Ukraine, and Ukraine trying to tell the world we still have allies like Uganda, like Ethiopia, wherever he went. And it was a strong statement of, look, while the world is condemning us, we actually have allies in Uganda. And what we saw was in that meeting, the next day they held a press conference and Museveni was saying, well, because of these oil prices, our colleagues have said they're going to be giving us oil and therefore we can run through it. Now, it's the global politics of it. Uganda looking at Russia and looking at China, trying to go east, and therefore the position of Uganda in the Ukraine-Russia, in Russian invasion of Ukraine, then Uganda then, and I had an interview with Uganda's Foreign Affairs Minister who said that every question I was asking, does Uganda condemn the war in Ukraine? He would then look at, but what did the Americans do, right? We saw them, attack Afghanistan, we all these other countries, these Americans, right? Rather than just focusing on what is Uganda's statement or position on the Ukrainian, does Uganda condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And then, smoothly they navigate away from it to go to, but what did the Americans do, right? And we saw that. And so for me, you have heads of states that all come and go to Accra or to Addis. They will not give you a common position because they have different interests, right? Because look, for example, Uganda's health budget is funded by the Americans. We know that. Americans are funding our troops in AMISOM. We know that. What is America's position on the Ukrainian crisis? They're up against it, right? What is Uganda's position in the thick of it all? We are seeing Lavrov here. And the next day, of course, Foreign Affairs are saying, but Greenfield is also coming. We welcome her. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US's permanent representative to the Security Council and to the United Nations. She's also coming. We also welcome her, right? And so you look at the political interests and where that leads us with our relationship, right? And think that there was an article that was published by Ahmed Haji in the New Vision that Uganda should choose its political allies, international allies, very carefully. You can read it and you will get a few things here and there. But yeah, that's my view, right? You have so many big-headed people or people who have different political standings, bring them in one room to make a decision to say, as Africa, we stand against the war is not about to happen, in my view. But that's my view, right? Not anyone's view. It's my view and I'm entitled to mine. Prof, before we let you go, one last one from me. The global conversation, the US President Joe Biden has warned of a possible Armageddon if Russia ever uses nuclear weapon on Ukraine. And that's a statement he made last week. And of course, I was in the US last week and everyone was talking about it. What was the president meaning by a possible Armageddon? Of course, the world has been thinking of what if Putin presses that wrong button and releases a nuclear weapon on Ukraine? And of course, to some that could lead to a possible World War III. Is it possible that Russia can use nuclear weapon or arsenal in Ukraine, and what would be the dangers?
Yes, of course, we are worried about this, but it seems unlikely, but everything's possible. So it's feasible. It's theoretically possible for them to do it. Not only they can use nukes, they can use other types of weapons of mass destruction, like biological or chemical weapons, for instance. There is also a possibility. I think if they're really cornered, if they're in a dead end, if they're pushed more and more away from Ukraine, and this war looks more and more like a defeat, he can do it. The hope is there, though, that there will be people around him who will be pushing back finally at a certain point. He wasn't opposed, frankly, or at least openly, by anyone in his entourage, in his inner circle, since February. But when it comes to pushing the button, it's not individual decision. In any country, it's not just one guy, president, who puts his finger across next to the button. So it should be other people involved. So I really hope that at this point, the generals, for instance, would understand that this is really, really crossing red line in a major way. And I also hope that the messages they're receiving in Moscow right now from a lot of our Western allies are resolute enough, because there has been an open threat that if Russia crosses that line, then there will be a devastating strike by conventional weapons, most probably not nuclear weapons, from US and other NATO members against Russian troops in Ukraine. And the Russian generals know that Americans have this capacity to do this. Look, they only gave us something like 20 HIMARS. This is a multiple launch rocket system, which Americans have been producing since 1980s. And this has already made a major turning point in the war in favor of Ukraine, and contrary to what Russians were trying to achieve. So imagine that they used even more contemporary weapons against Russian troops. That would be devastating. That would be really end of basically Russian military forces to speak of. And a dangerous step towards escalation, because then Russians would actually think about using strategic weapons, not just on Ukraine, but on those NATO countries. And that becomes really something we don't want to see. But I hope there is enough rationality and pragmatism, at least through the prism of survival mode in Moscow, which would prevent them from doing this.
Thank you, Professor Dobovyk. Thank you very much, from Odessa. Thank you very much. We're sending you love from Uganda. Can we give a round of applause? Thank you for finding time to speak to us. We pray that you and your family are safe, and indeed the people of Ukraine, as of course Russia continues with its invasion and sadly attacking civilians, launching.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thank
you very much. May God bless you and keep you. Thank you very much. Another round of applause, Prof. And another round of applause to Grace. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you. And another round of applause to the American Center for Organizing these gatherings. All right, and another round of applause to me. Thank you all, the online team and everyone who attended. Thank you. You can find the recording of this on the US website and indeed on their different social media platforms. So be sure to go out there. My name is Solomon Sserwanja. Good evening. And do you want to come and give out any announcements or anything?